Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started on our webinar today. Really appreciate everyone dialing in. Today's webinar is the 2014 Mobile Experience Benchmark. We'll be walking through the benchmark report and then also giving you some insight on how to take action with your own mobile applications, what this means, what insights you can draw from the report, and how to actually take steps to improve your own mobile application. So just as a quick point of housekeeping here, we are recording this session, so afterwards we'll be mailing out the recorded link so that you have access to what we're covering. So if you miss anything or you would like a copy of it, you'll be getting that. I'd also like to mention that while you are going to be muted, we've muted the lines for audio. You will be able to type into the Q&A pod. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A pod. Feel free to answer those on the right. Okay, so quick round of introductions. Myself, I'm Josh Van Tonder. I'm the Director of Product Marketing over at Crittercism. And joining me today is Rob Kwok, who is our CTO. Hi, Rob. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks, Josh.
So, Rob, we're really glad Rob could join. He's actually in Boston today for the ANDEV conference, and we'll be there for, Rob, you're there today and tomorrow, is that right?
Yep, today and tomorrow.
Awesome. So if anybody happens to be out in Boston and thinking of going out there, we'll be at ANDEV Con, so certainly feel free to stop by our booth out there. So let's just set up the agenda quickly and how we're going to use the time ahead of us. So we'll probably take about 45 minutes, 50 minutes for this webinar. And we'll start by just quickly stepping through how mobile performance is connected to business results. Then we'll talk a little bit about why getting performance in the mobile experience can be challenging in today's mobile environment. Then really the majority of the benchmark report will come next. So we'll walk through the key metrics to keep in mind, what are some of the benchmarks, and more importantly, how to connect the dots to your own applications. From there, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk less about what the benchmarks are specifically, but how can you begin to collect and act and measure the performance of your own applications to improve the performance and ensure that you have a competitive app. And so I'll do the first part of the slides with the benchmark, and then I'll be turning it over to Rob as really the key person to help build the product here, to help you understand ways to use and leverage tools to improve the performance of your apps. So with that, let me jump into just a very brief background of Crittercism. For folks who may not have heard of Crittercism, let me give you kind of the 101. We are a mobile-focused company, meaning we've focused our efforts on delivering a solution from the ground up that is very mobile-centric. So it works with all the major mobile platforms on all form factors and across all the different carriers, Wi-Fi, and network connectivity that mobile apps typically operate in. We have a SaaS-based offering that operates at mobile scale, meaning we monitor over 1 billion monthly average users, and we have tens of thousands of applications under management, thousands of customers in 120 countries. We've lucky enough to have a number of great investors: Scale, Google Ventures, Shasta, Opus, Kleiner, strategic investments from Accenture, and really what I'm just hoping to leave you with is our DNA is really all about mobile, and that's what we're coming to the table with, some information focused on mobile performance that we gathered from the database, big data information that we have. And where does this come from? Well, we collect information that we help provide to our customers that enables them to improve the performance of their own mobile applications. And so we operate across a number of verticals, customers in technology like eBay, PayPal, Netflix, LinkedIn, sort of the who's who of some of the big tech firms. We also have customers in the financial services space, e-commerce like Urban Outfitters and Walmart, gaming, a lot of folks in media. And so really a pretty wide range of companies that are leveraging our technology. So that's all I really wanted to say about Crittercism. We'll give you a bit more sort of context as we move forward. But next, what I'd like to do is do a quick poll question just to understand a bit more about the audience right now. So we're going to start with the very first poll question, and you should see this pop up on your screen. And the poll is about the type of apps you have. The first question is, how many B2C or consumer-facing mobile apps does your company plan to release or have under management this year? So 1, 2, 3 to 5, or 5 plus. If you could take a moment just to answer that first poll question, and it just helps Rob and I get a sense of your priorities as we walk through the content that we'd like to do. So I'll just give another 5 seconds or so just to finish that up, and then we're going to jump into the next poll question. So if you could let's take a look at the results for this first one. And obviously, you know, we're all familiar with B2C apps. I'm sure all of us use them. Okay, we're just waiting for the results here, and then we'll show the next version. So the next question is going to be about B2E apps. So if you could, for those of you with B2E apps. Okay, so here, I'm just going to read off the results here. It looks like, well, it's pretty wide mix. So a chunk of you have, it looks like the average is about 3 B2C focused apps. So really, most of you have, those of you that are releasing them have more than one typically, so either by platform or by function. So we're going to go ahead and do the second poll question, which is now more focused on the business to employee facing apps. So what does that mean? This is an app that, you know, maybe you have a field force like store associates in a retail location that are using iPod to, you know, do point of sale, or, you know, perhaps you have inspectors or workers out in the field like a cable company where you're going to install and you use a mobile app. So these are B2E facing apps. If you could take a moment and answer that question. Okay, just give it a second or so here. Okay, and here come the results. So the reason we're asking this is we're finding that the companies that we work with, obviously mobile is completely central to their business. It's very mission critical, but there are two arms to this, and many companies do both. One is direct to consumer related applications, you know, banking or shopping applications, media applications. And then on the B2E side, these are the apps that your employees or partners would use. So here, looks like a chunk of folks on the line are more B2C focused from what I'm seeing here, but there are about almost a little over 20% that have B2E apps. Okay, great, thank you, that's helpful. I just wanted to get a sense of what applications you're using. So let's jump into this. The very first thing is to think about, well, why would you want to optimize the performance of your mobile apps? Just to put some context around this, starting off with, it is absolutely critical from the perspective of the brand, the revenue, and even the productivity of your team that it is responsible for ensuring your mobile apps run well. So what you're looking at here, I took a couple screenshots of reviews. One is from Twitter and the other is from an actual App Store review. And just to give you context, so the one on the left-hand side is for a large financial institution, and the person is, you know, they say, so frustrated by the, you know, blank mobile deposit feature on my iPhone 5, why does it keep crashing, help. And then in this particular case, there's actually a support response. So, you know, kudos to the company for having a team responding to this, and they're suggesting, you know, closing and restarting the app. So, you know, perhaps not the most useful advice, and the reason for that is usually companies that see these kinds of behaviors on apps don't know what caused the problem for the end user. And that's what we'll be talking a bit more about. It's very difficult to understand what specific users are running into, what problems they're running into, because it's on their device. The app runs on their device, and you don't typically don't have great insight into the performance on the end user's device. Another one is, gosh, doesn't work, won't let you view items in your cart or checkout, won't let you search for things, very buggy. So here you can see, the direct revenue impact of a shopping cart transaction has been impacted because they're unable to do the checkout. So, typically slow transactions or performance crashes here are what's at stake. So just wanted to, connect the dots to why performance really matters. And we are looking at slightly more B2C style scenarios because I'm, taking something from Twitter and something from the App Store. We obviously talk to a lot of customers and companies that have BDE apps. Rob's often on the forefront of that as sort of our CTO. He's often engaged directly with customers, trying to understand, product features we'll be building out. So Rob, here's more of B2C, but when you look at it more from a B2E perspective, what kinds of aspects are companies thinking about? What impacts does a poor performing BDE app have to their company?
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. And I think to the point on the right-hand side of the screen, having problems with checkout or add to cart. I was talking to a major retailer that was having a problem where for 30 minutes every day during peak West Coast sales time, checkout was failing in their app. And we've seen, I think, in the last year or two, this increase in the number of companies that are using, iPads for, in the case of Urban Outfitters, they're using iPads for checkout in their stores. We have companies like trucking companies tracking shipments. We have field force enablement using apps for that, and we've seen, a lot of these mobile issues are, critical to the revenue of a lot of companies. So definitely seeing a lot there on the B2B side as well.
Good stuff. So let's, I'm going to move forward into more of the benchmark data. The starting point is, well, what makes it difficult for companies to deliver high-performing apps? And the story really centers around the complexity of the mobile ecosystem and the fragmentation inherent in the modern mobile ecosystem. And it's really orders of magnitude more complicated than traditional web-based applications because you as the company don't own all the infrastructure or the devices or the stack on the devices that the end user is running on. So as an example, looking across our own database, which has, over 1 billion monthly active users, we see over 2,500 different device manufacturer models. We see over 100 different OS versions, right? So each iOS version has point releases, Android has point releases, Windows Phone, etc. And then these all run on different network infrastructure. So just from the carrier side, you're thinking of almost 700 different unique carriers that we see in our system. And if you think about all the different permutations of those components, just those alone, you're looking at over 100 million permutations, which means it's really incredibly hard to test every combination. I mean, it's not possible. And so that is really one of the core inherent problems that makes it hard to ensure that an app works well across every device, in every geo, on every OS, etc. The other aspect that adds to the complexity is apps of today are composite. What do I mean by that? They are built by plugging into underlying services. So these are back-end services, either third-party or your company's own services, like Facebook for authentication or Twitter. Perhaps you connect to YouTube. So there are a number of different services that could be used under the covers by the app to provide functionality or core critical internal back-end services, like the ability to do an e-commerce transaction. And looking at our database, we see apps tend to have about 5 or 6 different unique services, back-end or cloud services that they connect to provide the ultimate functionality. And many apps have more than this. So that just adds, one more layer of complexity that you need to be able to wrestle to the ground to ensure performance. So there are really 2 main pillars of performance to to understand. So the complexity ultimately impacts performance, and if you think about two halves to the puzzle, one half is controlling the uptime or stability of the application, and the second half is about the responsiveness that the end user experiences, meaning the underlying performance of those services, how they help determine the ultimate performance of the application. So we're going to look at both of those and give you some benchmarks and how to interpret those for your app. So let's start with responsiveness. By this I mean the responsiveness, the latency, the error rates associated with the cloud services or the backend services that your application depends on. And like I said, we see about 5 or 6 on average being used by apps today. And this ultimately impacts the end user performance. So you want to understand which services have the highest error rates, and how is my app going to perform in different locations. So let's start off with the high-level perspective, which is just raw service performance from a latency or error rate standpoint. To put some context around this, there have been some studies on human perception that we use as benchmarks for how the end user experiences the application. And typically, what you would find is that people begin to make a mental context shift. They're actually aware that something is slow at about the 1 second point. And this is based on studies of human perception. There's a link below. You can take a look if you're interested. And so ultimately, you want your app to strive to not have much more than a 1 second delay. And services are a core component that help or hurt that ultimate performance. So one side of this is the actual latency of the service. Looking across our database, we found that about 1 in 10, so 9% of the service calls made by applications that we monitor, or services made from applications we monitor, have over 1 second, right? So they don't meet that 1 second benchmark. And then the other aspect of this is, if they're not slow, do they even work at all? And what we find is about almost 1 in 5 have reasonably high error rates, meaning over 5% error rate. So a good portion of the service calls that your app depends on are not even functioning, and that results in blank data in the app, or the app potentially even crashing, or a delay in the action for the end user. So the other way to think about this is, okay, well, how do these services perform? Like if my user is in Canada, or if they're in Australia, or if they're in Europe, how's that performance going to differ versus someone in the US? So what you're looking at here is the responsiveness. Here we're looking at response times by geography. And you can see that the location of the end user has an impact to the performance that they would experience, the end user on their device, how the services would actually respond, how snappy are they. And that, again, impacts what the end user experience on the phone. And, Rob, I think this is something I think you've been heavily involved in, kind of the geolocation aspect of our performance monitoring. I know you've run into a couple interesting stories about how the geography has impacted the performance of mobile applications. I was wondering if you could maybe share a couple anecdotes.
Yeah, I think geolocation has been a source of really interesting performance issues for a lot of companies. We've had a payment provider launch one of their chip and pin apps in the UK, and they had an issue where payments were just failing. They had no idea what was going on. They spent 3 months debugging the issue, and finally they discovered that it was literally a steel bridge that was blocking communication between their devices and their server. There was a courier service that launched in New York, and they had all these problems with latency, and they finally discovered it was actually due to their carrier, and they actually switched to another carrier, and that fixed their problems. China is also a great source of issues as well. A lot of companies launch their app in the US, everything works great, and then they launch it in China, and there's all sorts of issues because of China's firewall. So, location, I think, has been one of the most tricky parts of, deploying a mobile app, and lots of interesting stories we've heard. I'm sure there'll be a lot more as we go along. And
definitely, critical as most companies sort of scale up their apps. I mean, as you enter new markets, this is an area where you want to have insight into, as you expand, the footprint of your application, how is it going to perform in new markets that you're trying to target. So we looked at the app service performance by, just raw error rates and latency on average, and we looked at it from a geography perspective. The one thing that I wanted to mention is, there are two, broadly speaking, two big categories of services your app could use, right? I mean, one could be your own back-end services, like maybe you have an e-commerce system or a CRM that you're connecting to, but there are also third-party services that your app can depend on. Maybe it's your analytics provider, maybe you have CDN, perhaps you're using something like Facebook or Twitter to manage the authentication associated with your application. And the point that I'd like to leave, or the takeaway I'd like to leave you with is the performance characteristics can vary depending on the particular provider you're using and just the circumstances of how you're using those. So what I think you should keep in mind is that you want to try and understand and monitor the performance of those third-party services just as you would your own internal services. And that's something that is a little trickier to do because you're connecting directly from your mobile device, or excuse me, the end user's mobile device to that service. It's not necessarily going through you. So it can be a little tricky to understand how those perform. And so trying to get insight into that is something that is very important from the perspective of what impact does that have for your end user. And what you can see here is a pretty big variation in, on average, how we see these services perform across the apps we monitor. This isn't anything good or bad about particular services. The point I'm trying to leave you with is definitely try to understand the performance of services that your app depends on. We have had particular customers that have used this kind of data when they monitor their own apps to change the types of services that they're using based on the performance and the locations and the circumstances that they're operating in. So that's the responsiveness section. I'd like to transition to the other core pillar of performance that I think is very important for mobile applications to or owners of mobile applications to understand, and that's uptime. The other way to, the other term here is crash rates. Uptime is simply, 1 minus the crash rate. It's just, another term, similar term to monitor, if you will. It's sort of a proxy for availability of your mobile application. But it's absolutely fundamental, right? Before anything happens with your app, if it crashes, the user is not going to care about anything else that occurs in the app. So it's a very fundamental measure of the end user experience. And you'd like to understand, how are the different devices impacting the user experience? Are there particular performance implications on different OSs or specific versions of your application? So it's a very fundamental piece of the performance, and we're going to jump to a poll question actually right there. So what I'd like to get a sense of first is, at a high level, how do you find out about issues about your company's mobile apps, whether this is crashes, whether this is slowness or other core performance issues with your mobile application? What's the most likely source of information that you're getting this from? So the first place that you could potentially get this, we see a lot of people getting from App Store reviews. Another would be, gosh, I get it from the support tickets. I have potentially social media comments. Maybe they're direct emails to product managers, or I know we run into situations where the CEO would get an email and then the CEO go talk to the product manager, or potentially you have tooling in place or other mechanisms. So go ahead and answer some of the potential options here, and we'll just wait about a second here while that populates, and then I'll show you your responses. And we also did a survey late last year to understand the types of response channels that customers are having. And as we move into the uptime performance, the reason I'm asking this here is, honestly, the crash rate is one of the first most graphic examples that an end user runs into. So having a good understanding of how to get that information and how to that information be proactive is key. All right, so here are the results. It looks like either people have another source of information, so something I haven't put on here, and potentially there's some other tooling layer or another input channel. Some people get it from customer support, so maybe 1 in 10 are coming through customer support, and then the rest are split through App Store and email responses. Okay, well, like I said, we also did this survey of a number of end users. So we contacted a number of end users the latter part of last year and asked, well, what do you do like when an app doesn't perform well? The most common response we got as an answer in the poll question was, or survey question rather, well, I uninstalled the app. Then there's a number of responses that are more referral based. I told a friend, I left a negative review, I shared it over social media. But the one that's interesting here is only about 20% let the company know directly through typical support channels. And that's something you want to try. It's always good to see if you can get ahead of that, right? I mean, you want to understand when the end user is running a performance, and only 1 in 5 are doing it through the channel that people would typically expect. So. And the poll responses we just saw, even less of the folks on the line here on the webinar would get it through that channel. So the takeaway is, customers do take an action when they run into poor performance, and a crash is one of the most fundamental ones. So looking at the benchmarks, the first thing that we wanted to answer is, okay, well, on average, like what are the majority of applications? What's their stability? And what you can look at here, the 47% is saying that 47% of the apps that Crittercism monitors have crash rates between 0 and 1%, and then the rest have over 1%. So I think the takeaway here is if you want to be competitive, by competitive I mean at least half of the apps out there, you need to have crash rates under 1%. And anecdotally speaking, we know that when companies begin using our service before they've begun monitoring and optimizing, it's very common to have crash rates in the 3+ range. 3 to 10% is not uncommon for an app that hasn't been optimized for stability and performance. And the reason for that is it's difficult to have insight into the true issues and the true scale of this unless you have a tool that monitors the end user's device. And so the other way to think about the crash rate is, you just showed me different uptime percentages, or crash rate here is the one minus this, so 99% uptime is a 1% crash rate. I'm looking at here just a hypothetical scenario. This is a company that has a large mobile revenue footprint, like say Starbucks, which has a very large mobile revenue footprint. They do about $1 billion over mobile. And we just plugged in here to show you, well, if you scale uptime percentages, how much downtime does that sort of mean for your app once it's out there? And then correspondingly, based on that, well, how much potential revenue, if you have a transaction going through your app, how much potential revenue could you lose? So the punchline is better uptime means the users are on the app more, which means whatever the business goal you're trying to accomplish should be high, you'll have less negative impacts, right? So let's look at just a couple different dimensions on uptime or crash rate. So the first is looking at it from a platform perspective. So we looked at Android first, and if you look at the purple bubble, that represents the platform version. So Kit Kat, Ice Cream Sandwich, Jelly Bean have about a 0.7% crash rate. And then Gingerbread, which is a slightly older release, has about a 1.7% crash rate. And we put it on there because it still has a fairly large adoption, just because it's often on some of the devices that have lower performance characteristics, and it runs well on that. So looking at it from a different perspective, which among the top devices that we see on our system, we just took the top devices for phone and tablet and Android. How does it vary? And the top line takeaway here is we see slightly better performance on the smartphones versus tablets. And in this case, it turns out, Samsung has the lower of the top devices we see. So switching gears to the iOS world, same general lens across all the different apps and usage we see. Well, how does it compare across OS versions? So we see that, iOS 7 has a slightly better performance characteristics when it comes to crash rates than the older iOS 6, and similarly iOS 7.1 improved even more. And same general pattern here. The smartphones, the top smartphones, have a slightly better uptime performance characteristic than their tablet brethren. So the last sort of benchmark I wanted to show around uptime is more focused on the actual vertical view on this. So what we did is we looked at the top apps that we monitor in each broad category. And just to give you some context, some of our top apps have millions upon millions of MAUs, so they're quite statistically significant sample sizes here. And we looked across e-commerce, social and communication, business, news, media, and gaming categories. And just to give a sense of for the best-in-class apps, what are the crash rates look like? So you can see here, for e-commerce apps that are associated with some type of retail-like transaction, we have about a 0.4%. And that's critical, because if you're trying to do an actual business transaction and it blows up, you're going to immediately lose revenue. On the other end of the spectrum, we see gaming apps, which obviously often push the performance characteristics of the device, more video, more audio, more cutting-edge capability. And well, we see that the crash performance benchmark is a bit higher on average across the top apps that we monitor. So the way to sort of use this type of information is, well, given the vertical I'm in, you want to be able to ask yourself, well, how do I compare to this benchmark? What does my uptime metric compare, my crash rate metric compare to best in class? And ideally, you should be within range. The next question becomes, well, how do you get this kind of statistic on your application? And companies today, obviously you've been listening to this webinar about performance, and we like to think performance is absolutely crucial, and so do the companies we work with. And the capability, the solution, the tool set used is typically a mobile application performance management solution to help monitor this. So at the highest level, what is a mobile application performance management or monitoring tool? It's something that helps enterprises and developers understand the usage patterns, the performance, and sort of the end user frustrations that are run into for both B2C and B2B applications, right? This is sort of how Gartner described mobile APM. So Crittercism provides one of the leading mobile app performance management solutions. We run across all the major platforms: iOS, Android, Windows Phone, Android NDK, HTML5, and we provide both the uptime, meaning crash rates and errors, as well as the responsiveness side, so the latency and HTTP error rate components. And we have a very large footprint, right? We've have a lot of mobile momentum, if you will. We have over 1 billion monthly active users on the system. And at the highest level, this tool gives you the capability to monitor the performance metrics. Once you're kind of watching those, it also gives you insight into how to prioritize different performance issues that arise. And once you've determined which one to hone in on, it gives you a bunch of capabilities to triage and accelerate root cause analysis. And then furthermore, allows you to monitor and trend the performance characteristics of your app over time and across different filters or dimensions of your application that affect your business. So that gives you a bit of background on the performance benchmarks and how to interpret them, and a quick sort of broad intro to Crittercism. But what we'd like to do is give you a more nuts and bolts view on how to actually gather that information. So with that, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Rob. Rob's going to walk through a product demonstration. So Rob, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
All right, thanks, Josh. Okay, I just shared my screen. Let me know if you can't see my screen.
We can see you. Okay.
Great. So thanks, Josh. I think that was a great overview of some industry trends we've been seeing. I guess the next question is, what can I do, to monitor, one, monitor my app, see how well I compare against those benchmarks, and two, if I'm underneath those benchmarks or I'm not doing as well, what actionable data can I have to fix those issues? So I'll give a brief overview of the product. I'll start with the responsiveness side and then dive more into the crashing and the error monitoring side of it and uptime of the apps later on. So this is a dashboard that shows you, when Josh was talking about all of the external services, all those cloud services that an app is using, a view into, how those are affecting your app. And for a lot of companies that we talk to, they really don't have much data about how these third-party services are affecting their app. And what you're seeing here is, once you incorporate our SDK without adding any more lines of code, we can automatically, detect which third-party services your app is using. So in this case, a third-party service is anything from an ad SDK to an analytics provider to your own API to a CDN. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side here is a list of all these services that we automatically detect and profile in your app. So you can see here, Flurry has about 2.1 seconds of latency on average. We also provide, other statistics in addition to latency, so 4 main metrics. So latency, error rate, which is, both 400 or 500 responses from a server, as well as device-level errors, such as can't connect to a DNS, don't have internet when sending a request, as well as request volume and data in and out. And just by looking at this kind of high-level services view for your app, you can actually recognize if there's one or two SDKs that are causing slowness in your app. And in fact, we had a couple of companies that just looking at this data as well, they could quickly determine that there was an SDK that was causing problems in their app. I remember there was a financial services company in Europe that saw this data, and their development team had just added a bunch of ad SDKs and analytics SDKs to their app, and they had no idea that these were actually causing downtime issues in their app until they saw our data. And all this data is also very granular as well, so you can actually drill down and see for each of these services, what are the endpoints that are specifically being hit. And so if we drill down into one of those endpoints, this is an add to cart endpoint here. You can see the same kind of breakdown by latency, error rate, request volume, and data in and out. We also break this down by a bunch of diagnostic data as well. So you can see, for example, here, there's a bunch of carriers that are being used, and we've seen for a lot of customers that carriers can actually cause huge problems, especially on the network side. So sending a network request to a billing endpoint. A lot of third-party carriers want you to use their billing endpoints, and they'll block other billing endpoints in apps. We've seen that happen, especially more internationally, as well as media companies. So for companies that are streaming video or streaming audio, a lot of these carriers will actually do some sort of package shaping or some sort of denial from certain media companies, and that can cause a lot of problems in apps as well. And what you can do is actually drill down and see, for all those errors in the app, what are actually the source of those errors. And so, we drill down into this endpoint here, add to cart, and you can see here both kind of server-side issues where, maybe the URL wasn't found, maybe the service was unavailable, as well as device-level errors. So if you couldn't connect to the internet, if the connection was not secure, you couldn't connect to a DNS. And we found that there's been a lot of instances where companies are tracking a lot of these network requests from their server, and a lot of the times they're missing a lot of information because a lot of the times these network requests don't even make it to a server. We've had a bunch of companies that have had server-side monitoring tools, used our SDK, and then found out that, I think the example I gave earlier about 30 minutes every day, checkout wasn't working. This was actually a great use case for this part of our product, being able to see network requests for their checkout operations failing just by looking at this data from a mobile perspective. And finally, you can actually see that same breakdown here also by geolocation. So for all of these services as well as all the endpoints, you can actually see a global view of how these network endpoints are performing in your app. You know, I gave the example earlier about the problem where a financial services company was having issues with their payment app launching in the UK, and they were able to see that problem through this sort of interface. And again, this data is also very granular as well, so you can actually drill down within a country, within the state, and all the way down to a county level. And this is especially important for B2E companies, for example, that have you know, iPads as checkout devices and apps, and you want to see if store A is having issues versus store B, and being able to pinpoint issues that are occurring on a very granular geolocation sort of basis. And so a lot of these performance issues with network requests can actually cause a lot of downtimes in apps as well. And you know, earlier we were talking about the uptime of apps, and what we're seeing here is kind of our trends page where you can monitor the performance of uptime in your app. And we're one of the only companies in the mobile APM space that actually tracks application launches. It's because it's a really hard scaling problem, being able to track how many times people load an app across, you know, the 1 billion users that we're currently tracking today. But what this provides is a lot of context around all these issues that you're seeing and figuring out, you know, how are these impacting my business? And so what you're seeing here is, you know, daily active users, monthly active users, great kind of basic analytics tools. But what's really been key for a lot of companies is tracking this metric here, the percentage of sessions that are crashed by app version. And here's, you know, we're comparing, we're talking about what Josh was talking about earlier, where, you know, where you want to be is between 0 and 1% of the time your app is crashing. So having about 99% uptime in order to be competitive. And as you can see here, you know, this is an app that's live in the App Store. You know, the latest version here, or one of the versions here has, you know, 7%, and you know, they've been able to improve this over time, but you know, they're still, I think, above the 1% number here. And for a lot of companies, you know, this is a big deal, especially in the e-commerce space where you have transactions that just can't fail because, you know, people are checking out and real revenue is flowing through these apps. And you know, this is where you can kind of see at a high level, you know, how well is my app performing over time. And by the way, you can, you know, set alerts on this data. So if you launch a new version of your app, you can actually see, you know, how well your app is doing and get real-time notifications if your app is not performing well. And scrolling down to the bottom here, you can see also a breakdown by device, by OS as well. So, you know, when Apple launches a new device, a lot of the times that can cause issues in apps. If Apple launches a new OS or a new Android OS comes out, that can cause a lot of downtime issues as well. And what we really provide is a way to, our bread and butter is really providing a way to fix these issues. And so drilling into the crash report screen, this is where you can see at a high level what are all the code level defects that are causing downtime in your app. And you can sort this, filter it by app version, by time, as well as some workflow. So we tie into bug tracking systems like GitHub, Jira, and Pivotal, and you can actually push any of these downtime issues and create issues in any of those bug tracking systems. And so here we're taking these 100,000 almost issues that have occurred in the last month, and we run them through some algorithms and figure out, and group them into unique code level defects in your app. And what's great about this is you can sort by, not only the last time it occurred, the number of times it occurred, but more importantly, the number of unique users that were affected by these issues. And what you can do for a lot of companies is take the top 10 issues here and put them into a 2-week sprint and fix the majority of your downtime issues in 2 weeks. And you can also search this list as well. So if you had some sort of, I think we're talking about some third-party SDKs causing downtime in apps, you can search this list and see kind of an impact in terms of all the third-party SDKs that are causing issues in your app as well. And we provide a lot of data to fix these issues as well. So if you drill into one of these issues here in particular, you can see a fully symbolicated stack trace. So we have integrations with CI systems like Hudson or Jenkins, or you can add a simple build script command to your Xcode project and automatically send us your DSIM, which allows us to deobfuscate your stack trace. You can see the exact file and line of code that was causing issues in your app, as well as any background threads that are running at the time or register data. In addition to the stack trace, we provide a lot of diagnostics. So anything from where in the world did a crash occur. So I was talking earlier about issues with localization or China's firewall. You can tell that right away here, as well as a slew of other diagnostics. So anything from memory usage. So if you had a memory leak in your app, you'd see this graph skewed to the right. We have a breakdown by app version, by model, by the OS, by the platform, how the user was holding the phone, to whether they're on Wi-Fi or not. And a lot of the times, companies have a lot of issues around testing their apps. And we had a company that had huge downtime issues on Motorola devices, and they didn't even have a Motorola device to test in their office. And a lot of the difficulty behind mobile development is really around this fragmentation in mobile, and accounting for every single one of these hardware and software permutations is incredibly difficult. And what we try to provide is data about how well if there's a specific permutation that's causing issues in your app. So in addition to providing this diagnostic data and the stack trace, we also provide very granular session data on a per user basis. So you can see, for example, all the user actions that led up to a performance issue, whether they went to a certain screen, clicked a button, a variable turned null, and that caused the app to crash. And you can also drill down and see all the particular users that experience this issue. And you can actually drill down into that user and see diagnostic data about that user and analytics about that user. So how many times they load the app, how many crashes they've had, what was their hardware and software that they're running on, and as well as any of the downtime issues that this user experienced. And this has been really key for a lot of companies in terms of the customer support case. So being able to set metadata on a user, you can set it to an identifier that's used internally. So when a support case comes in, they can actually look up that user by that ID and see what issues they had. And if that issue has been fixed, they can actually go back to that user and say, hey, I know you experienced this issue. It was actually fixed in this version of the app. If you simply upgrade your app, that issue should go away. So in addition to kind of these downtime issues in apps, we also provide logging capability. So what we call handled exceptions, being able to see if there are any errors that occurred in your app that didn't necessarily cause downtime, but caused a bad user experience. So this could be cases where you tried to connect to your API and that failed. If you had some sort of memory condition in your app, you can actually log all those issues to us as well. And finally, the last thing I'd like to talk about is that all this data is provided in real time. And this is one of the, I think, sexiest parts of our product. This is our live stats page. This provides kind of a real-time monitor of application launches, crashes, exceptions, any sort of performance issues that occur in your app. And a lot of companies, put this into monitors in their office because, when they're launching a new version of their app, or if they want to monitor on a daily basis how well their app is performing, this is kind of their heartbeat monitor of seeing, how well is their app performing. And this kind of illustrates that how our data is all done in real time. You can set real-time alerts on any of this data. And mobile is a fast-moving industry, and if you're not up to date on everything that's going on, it's a critical part of your business. So I'd like to pause there and answer any questions that you guys have.
Rob, one that came up that I think is maybe a more basic one is how do you kind of get this data from your app? I mean, how are we collecting it? How does someone get started with hooking up their app to get this kind of thing?
Oh yeah, great point. So we do have an SDK. We're on a bunch of different platforms. We have an iOS, an Android, HTML5, and Windows Phone 8 platforms. And it's basically an SDK integration where you can drag and drop a file, add 2 lines of code, and you're off and running. There's a bunch of customization you can do as well. Setting metadata on a user is one more line of code, and tracking user interactions leading up to performance issues is also one more line of code that you can customize.
Good. And there was one sort of about there's crash rates that looked like they were session-based and user-based. What was the difference between the two?
Sure. So I think we were looking earlier around the crash trends page, and so there's 2 key metrics here. One on the left-hand side is just the percentage of sessions that have crashed by version. So every time the user loads an app from the background or from a cold start, we track that as an application launch, and so that kind of gives you kind of an impact analysis by percentage of sessions that are crashed. Another metric that a lot of companies track is just the percentage of users that have experienced an issue on a daily basis. And this kind of gives you a relative impact on how many users, unique users, are having issues in your app.
Okay, and then one final one. I think we saw a lot of analytics sort of SDKs even in the list of apps. Maybe I think the question is a bit more about how does this analytics differ from this kind of data? It looks like customers use both. So what's the difference?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies use both Crittercism and an analytics provider. We do provide some analytics data like that, the number of active users, but really our focus is more around the performance impact of these issues. You typically use an analytics provider to kind of do like a funnel analysis or demographic analysis around your app. But a lot of the times, for a funnel, you can tell if a user is failing to check out in your app or failing to create an account because maybe there's too many steps in the funnel, or maybe a button's placed in the wrong place. What we want to provide is kind of if there's performance data performance issues that are affecting that funnel. So if the app crashed, if there's a network request that failed, we want to provide that performance context around these metrics that companies are tracking.
Great. Well, I'm looking at the time here, so in the interest of time, we're going to start wrapping things up and make sure everybody gets back to their work on time. So thanks, Rob. Really appreciate you walking through that. I think hopefully provides a bit more clarity on the how in terms of getting benchmarks on your performance in order to compare to other apps in the industry that you would want to compare against. So just very quickly, wanted to leave folks with a sense of how this type of tooling layer can really provide real ROI for your mobile strategy. We've worked with companies like Hearst, who were able to optimize their mobile apps. They have a huge number of mobile apps for all their different media channels. And they started out with an uptime above, they had a crash rate about 3%, and they were able to drop that to under 0.5%, and a corresponding improvement in star ratings and reviews. We worked with DocuSign, who had a number of benefits, being able to reduce the time spent fixing issues. So it would often take 2 weeks to troubleshoot and resolve an issue, and they were able to drop that to under 2 days. So much more time for the engineering team to actually focus on features, not on bugs. And along the way, they were able to actually accelerate how quickly they were making product releases because they had much more clarity on the performance of the app once it was released. So they were more confident and capable of releasing their apps faster. So they went from a handful of releases a year down to 2, 3, 4 week releases. And then Urban Outfitters, who I think we mentioned once or twice, had they had both B2C and B2E apps, and on both sides were able to improve the uptime performance of those applications pretty dramatically. So from 10%, I think, on the B2E side and 6% on the B2C side down to about 1% or under. So this all, impacts the brand. It impacts the ultimate revenue, certainly if you have transactions flowing through the application, and the productivity of your team that's supporting these apps. So, I mean, you see numbers where things took, weeks to fix and now go down to days or hours even. So with that, I'd like to draw to a close. Thank you, Rob, so much for taking time on your trip in Boston. Really appreciate it.
Anytime, Josh.
And with that, thank you, everyone. Crittercism obviously is happy to provide more information. You can sign up for free and give a trial of our mobile application performance management solution. Just go to Crittercism.com and you can sign up for free, and it only takes a few minutes to kind of get up and running and start collecting information. We certainly would be happy to answer any questions or give you a hand if you need anything. Responsiveness and uptime are, just minutes away from you collecting them, and it really provides a huge amount of insight into the end user experience of your applications in order to deliver better, smarter, faster apps. So with that, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us, and feel free to reach out to us. There are a couple questions that came in and we weren't able to finish those up because of time, and we'll try to reach out to you afterwards. We'll be sending out a recording of this, and thank you very much.